strive to cover not only investment and financial issues at this forum, but also things that really impact our clients' lives. And we have kind of a good time all year of thinking through what are the potential topics that we want to cover for this session of the program. And this year, it was a New York Times article that really led us to our subject matter. The title of the article was, "Welcome to Your Obsolescence." And as you can tell from the title, it leaned a bit towards scare tactics, but the focus was really on the impact of technology on the future job market. So how will technological advances change or even eliminate certain careers, including highly skilled careers? And what new jobs and career tracks will pop up that we haven't even thought of yet? Fortunately, it turns out one of the leading experts on this topic resides right here in the Chicagoland area, Dr. Joel Mokyr. Dr. Mokyr is a professor at Northwestern University and a professorial fellow at the University of Tel Aviv. A highly acclaimed author and researcher, Professor Mokyr is a noted expert on the social and economic impacts of the Industrial Revolution in Western Europe. In his research, he often reminds us that we have been through times of tremendous technological change before, and we can use our knowledge of those transformative times to make some predictions and preparations for future change. And when we first reached out to ask Dr. Mokyr to be with us today, it was really hard to reach him because he was in Italy accepting the 2015 International Balzan Prize in the field of economic history. It's a prestigious honor that since 1957 has only had 3 Americans be awarded that honor. So we were thrilled when he agreed to be with us here today, and it's really been a pleasure getting to know him and learn from him in preparation for this session. So I'm now going to hand things over to Dr. Mokyr.
Thank you very much. What I needed. Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry to wake you up all that early, but you know, work is work. I'm delighted to be here. Let's get to business. I'm going to raise 3 questions. I don't think I'll answer them to your full satisfaction, but at least I'll do my best. And let me sort of briefly tell you what they are. The first is to get into a debate that you've all been reading about, which I've been involved in a great deal, but I'm going to be fairly brief about this because it's not really the topic of my talk today. But I think we should ask the question whether the almost dizzying rate of technological advance that we've experienced, say, in the last 30 or 40 years is actually going to continue, or whether, as some people have been arguing repeatedly in the last few days, you know, basically this is going to slow down because, as the saying goes, all the low-hanging fruits have been picked, and so essentially, what, you know, the easy inventions have been made, and now it's going to slow down because the rest of the problems are just too difficult. I'm going to argue against that proposition, and maybe not surprisingly, but I'll do so fairly briefly. And then the main point today will be, you know, what will its effect be on the future of work? And as Anna said, you know, the question is being raised continuously. Will people be replaced by computers, by robots, by artificial intelligence, by something mechanical that isn't human? And the other question I want to deal with fairly briefly is, for those who will not be replaced, for those who will continue working, how will the nature of work actually change? And finally, if I have any time left, I may say a few words about whether policymakers can do something about it. All right. So the first question, my answer, as I said, is unequivocal. There are far more fruits to be picked off this tree, which, you know, I'm not quite sure that that's what they had in mind when they wrote about the tree of knowledge in the book of Genesis, but so the analogy is kind of nice. And if I may just continue the metaphor a little bit, I think what happens, of course, is that the tree is still laden, but we have to build taller and taller ladders to get to the higher hanging trees. And that, of course, is exactly what science does for us. And so basically my argument is, and you know, this is in some ways rather scary and disconcerting if you're so inclined, is as far as technological change is concerned, despite the fact that the last 2 centuries have been dizzying and much faster than technological change has happened for the rest of human history, I think basically, to use the old American idiom, you ain't seen nothing yet. What is going to come is going to be much bigger than what we have seen. And let me sort of try to at least show you why I believe that, even though you may not necessarily be convinced. Not everybody is. The argument I'm making, it's part of a set of arguments. I'm not going to give the whole story here. But basically, as I see it, technology isn't moving by itself. It's moving by a deeper and detailed knowledge of natural regularities and phenomena. That's in some ways bigger than just science. Science is just a part of that, but it is very much critical to that. But you ask yourself the question about science. How does science itself move? And here I want to make a point that has often been neglected, and that is that one of the things that science needs is hardware. It needs instruments, it needs tools, it needs to observe, to test, to measure, to compute, search for information, and all that. And so science gets that from technology. It gets that from the engineers. And so if you realize that science is affected by technology and then again is affected, of course, what we have is a classical positive feedback model in which you have, on the one hand, knowledge science, which I call knowledge what, okay, which is shorthand for it, and then knowledge how is technology. And of course, the technology provides science with the instruments, and science provides technology with discoveries and theorems and whatever. And clearly, this is a classical positive feedback mechanism. And as we know, such feedback mechanism under lots of conditions actually do not ever settle down. They do not ever converge, as we say in economics. Instead, they keep growing and growing and growing and eventually explode. That is why I say you ain't seen nothing yet. So since I do economic history for most of my time, let me give you a little bit of sort of examples of the past, and basically argue here that the great takeoffs of science, including the great scientific revolution of the 17th century, which has giants they all learned about in high school, like Galileo and Newton and so on, that great flourishing was actually stimulated and made possible by instruments made by skilled instrument makers and artisans. You ask yourself, where would Galileo have been without his telescope? Now, he actually made the telescope himself, but, in some sense, he took off his hat as a scientist, put on his hat as an optical engineer, built a telescope, and so on. But this is obviously technology, knowing how to make a telescope, and then turning it into science by watching, the phases of Venus and the satellites of Jupiter, which he discovered. The same would have been, they went through, say, by somebody like Louis Pasteur, who in many ways is to 19th century biology what Galileo was to 17th century astronomy. Where would Louis Pasteur would have been without the improved microscopes that people were able to make in the 19th century, which allowed him essentially to nail the germ theory of disease, to my mind still one of the very greatest discoveries ever made by the human race. I could go on about this. There is, this is perhaps less well known. The first battery ever built was made by a man called Alessandro Volta in 1800, which of course ran nothing because it's the first battery run. What's going to run on batteries, right? But voltaic cell, fairly soon, a few years later, was realized it could be used for electrolysis. Electrolysis basically is necessary to study chemistry. Modern chemistry had just been born in the previous decade, thanks to the work of Lavoisier. And so people basically used the voltaic batteries to discover the difference between elements and compounds, which is, of course, the foundation of chemistry. And so this tool became critical in making chemistry what it is today in its first age. So what about today? Well, the tools that are available to scientists today are vastly more powerful, right? So Pasteur never had this. Okay, this is the Betzig-Hell type of stimulated emission depletion microscope used in nanotechnology, which actually won the Nobel Prize for its inventors a year or two ago. I mean, this is to the microscope that Pasteur used, what a Ferrari is to a bicycle. I mean, this is a totally different order of magnitude, okay? If you want to go far rather than nearby, this is a different thing. Galileo never had any of this. This is an extremely large telescope deploying lasers for adaptive optics. To show you what it can do, just a little example, I kind of like this. These are two pictures taken of the planet Uranus. This is made by a regular microscope, and this is made by a microscope using adaptive optics. I mean, this is an order of magnitude different. That's what I'm saying. These are tools that our technology puts at the service of science, and look at this. Of course, nobody had anything like this. This is the massive liquid-cooled supercomputer at Lawrence Livermore. It does, I think, over 16 petaflops. I think the Chinese now have a computer. This is about half a year old. So the Chinese have a computer that now does 30 petaflops. And I have no idea what comes after petaflops. I think it's brontoflops, but I could be wrong. They invent these names for these things, which are mind-boggling, but never mind that. But I just want to say, the computer is probably the single tool that has changed science more than anything else. We think of computers as, being useful in all kind of applied fields like manufacturing, agriculture, services, But in fact, research, pure research, is unthinkable today without computers. I mean, anything from nanotechnology to econometrics to medieval poetry, everybody uses computers. The question is not, what do computers do for us? The question people ask is, how the hell did we do anything before we had these computers? That's the question people ask. So obviously what they can do is, they can compute and do statistical analysis at a level that was unimaginable when I was a graduate student. It can store information and search it with, blinding speeds. It can literally find, a needle of a few microns in a haystack as big as Montana, in a matter of seconds. That's astonishing. It can, of course, do things that we could never do, like solve equations that have no solution. Well, you can't quite solve it, but you can simulate it, and this is particularly important in something called the Navier-Stokes equations, for those of you who remember your college physics. These are basically a set of equations that have no solution, but they describe what we call as turbulence. And turbulence is terribly important in many applied fields, including jet travel and hydraulics control and so on. We always knew how to describe this. We just couldn't solve the equations. Well, with modern computers, we're getting closer and closer. And so this is only going to get better because quantum computing, which is essentially on the horizon, is going to be extraordinarily useful in research, more perhaps so than in daily use. And so, basically, as I said, you ain't seen nothing yet. Okay, so that's sort of the prelude. Now, I'm going to get to the meat of the talk, and that is, if so, what is going to happen to work? So this is maybe the way we're going. So you can sort of see people in a cafeteria being served by these robots, but here, the robots themselves going to get a drink from a third robot. I know this is kind of I thought it's kind of a good description of the sort of nightmares that people have about how the robots are going to be taking over the world, and we will be sort of relegated to a bunch of kibitzers. I mean, that's I think what Ray Kurzweil and people like that are predicting. I don't think it's going to get that bad. It's probably a good idea to be more realistic about this. But my first reaction as a historian is, I have seen this movie before, and let me take you 200 years back to the Industrial Revolution in Britain. During the Industrial Revolution, British textile workers feared that machinery would replace them and in some ways make them redundant and create unemployment and poverty amongst the textile workers of the Midlands. And so what they did was they strongly resisted this. They resisted mechanization. And so this is the real Luddites. This is where this actually comes from. The word term Luddite comes from this movement. This is a bunch of Luddites in Nottinghamshire in England. There were also, the whole northern Midlands were sort of affected by that in those years. So it's exactly 2 centuries ago. And you can sort of see the famous picture of two guys near a wool finishing machine, where basically there was hammers, and irons breaking it down. And of course, the government didn't particularly like this, so there's a frame breaking. You get £200 reward if you rat on somebody. And British government cracked down quite hard on these people. Many of them were executed, and a larger number of people were transported to Australia, so it never went anywhere. But it gives you an idea that the fear of being made redundant by technological change is nothing new, and it's been around for a long time. Now, it's not just, of course, textile workers who are being made redundant by technological change. You look at what happened to U.S. farmers. So these are this is the proportion of labor force in agriculture. And you can sort of see that, at the time of the birth of the nations, about 3/4 of all American workers worked in agriculture. By the time of the Civil War, it's about half. And then it keeps going down, and today we're at 2.4%. Actually, that was in 2000. I think it's probably slightly lower now, but that's probably where it will settle. Now, what made this possible, of course, is the growth of productivity due to improved technology in agriculture, in which one person can feed far more people, by this kind of calculation. If you leave out imports, one person can feed 40 others. This is rather impressive. If you think about the Civil War, one person could find one other person. So that's absolutely huge. And you may well ask, well, whatever happened to these farmers? Well, the farmers weren't happy about it. We had farm protest movements in the post-Civil War period, but they couldn't stop this either. And clearly, what happened to these farmers? Most of them found jobs somewhere else. Some of them in cities, some of them in their own areas. But they had to leave agriculture because they had been made redundant. This did not overthrow the republic, nor did it create terrible upheaval. Some political friction, but nothing. I think, oops, I did something wrong here. There we go. Sorry. So this is what did I show you? Now, in the 20th century, in particular, this happened. The same thing happened with manufacturing, and again, the fear of being made redundant is nothing new. Here's a quote from Time magazine. This is 1961. I'm not going to read the whole quote to you, but I think you can look at this, read this quickly, okay? But essentially what they're saying is the number of jobs lost to more efficient machines is only part of the problem. Automation, blah, 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 blah. Many of the losses of factory jobs have been countered by the increase in the service industry, but automation is beginning to move in and eliminate office jobs too. And so, so this is clearly an expression of concern, which is not atypical of that time. But many of you, must, like me, were around in this period. The economy didn't collapse in the 1960s and 1970s. We did not have the streets full of desperate, unemployable workers who'd been kicked out from their jobs by machinery. And in fact, if you look at the whole record of industrialization and technological change over the last 250 years, the evidence for technologically induced unemployment is weak to non-existent. That doesn't mean, of course, for a second, that technology doesn't radically affect labor markets. How could it not? But it isn't in the sort of simple-minded way in which we're all going to be replaced by robots and thrown out in the streets, and something cataclysmic will happen. Now, the question, of course, is this time different? There is a serious concern today that the rate of technological progress, because it will accelerate, as I said earlier, that job creation may not keep up. And that's because technological change in our time appears to be somehow different. There's a recent article in the Journal of Economic Perspective by a robotics expert who basically declared that we are facing what he called a Cambrian explosion in robotics. Now, for those of you who need reminding, what the Cambrian explosion refers to is this very short, in geological time then, a period of very rapid diversification and creativity that happened about 500 million years ago on the Earth. And that's, I think, the analogy that the guy wants to make. And so basically, what he claims is that we're facing a similar explosion in the diversification and applicability of robotics and artificial intelligence. And so what will the robotics revolution really be like? And the truth is, I have no idea, and neither does anybody else. I think it's fair to say that robotics is today where computers were somewhere in the 1960s, early 1960s. Okay, so in the early 1960s, most of us knew that computers were going to do something for us, but it was very unclear how it would affect our lives. Nobody, I think, predicted the internet. Nobody predicted the smartphone. Nobody predicted lots of things that computers do for us. We just knew it was going to be big, and I think that's, in some sense, the same feel we have today about robotics. And so the question is, if robots are going to replace a lot of jobs, what's going to happen? And so again, I would like to submit to you that history is a little bit of, or I can give a little bit of guidance here. And here is a distinction I'd like to make. Economists distinguish between what I call process innovation, which is basically what we typically think of as classical productivity increase, in which we can make the same amount of output with fewer inputs. And so fewer inputs basically means less labor, and so labor is being thrown on the street or has to find at least a different job. But there's also something called product innovation, and product innovation basically means that we get totally new products that just weren't on the market before and now are on the market, and obviously these create new jobs. So what kind of new jobs? I don't know. But if we go back for a minute to the Luddites and ask yourself, well, what happened to these people who, many of them, had been made redundant by the mechanization of the textile industry? And two things happened. The first is because of the mechanization of the textile industry, the price of textiles went down, so a lot more textiles were being sold, not just in Britain itself, but also exported, and so actually the decline in textile jobs wasn't as bad as people feared. But more important, new products appeared on the markets, and the children of these weavers and framework knitters who were protesting as Luddites found jobs as railroad engineers, as telegraph operators, and subsequently as electricians, X-ray technicians, all kind of jobs that you couldn't have imagined in 1812. These were jobs that are a result of product innovation that simply wasn't predicted at all at that time. And I think the same is true basically today. If you're standing in 1914, a century ago, and you ask yourself, did anybody ever suspect the kind of job that somebody in 1914's grandchildren would have? If you told them, oh yes, your grandson will be a video game designer, a cybersecurity specialist, a GPS, they wouldn't have the foggiest idea what you're talking about. And I think we don't have the foggiest idea what kind of jobs will be available in 2050. Just as these people couldn't imagine. We can't imagine this because if we could, they would be here. And so, in short, technology eliminates jobs, it creates jobs. And the big question, of course, is which process will prevail. And so, I'm just trying to sort of give a little bit of a sense of what kind of jobs probably will survive. And one thing that we can predict with almost complete certainty is the aging of the population. Americans and people basically all over the world, it's just as bad in Japan and in China. The average age of the population will go up. There'll be more and more old folks around, and that essentially means that there will be jobs in things that will be relatively hard to fully automate, like geriatrics, pharmaceuticals, personal care, things like that. Now, it's imaginable that we will find, that we'll be able to discover or build robots that will take care of, grandmother when she's in her 90s. But I somehow think that is one of those places where the human touch will remain essential. We're likely to have fewer children. Anybody around the world, the birth rates are going down across the board. What that actually means is not necessarily fewer jobs, in education, because as we have fewer children, we want to invest in them more, and we want a better education. We want to send them to kindergarten at an earlier stage, and so exactly because we have fewer children, we invest more in them, and therefore I think actually jobs in education will increase. I'm not saying digital technology will not have an effect. All I'm saying is it may not make humans redundant. It will just change the jobs. I mean, if you look at a website like WebMD, and so you ask yourself, does WebMD make doctors redundant? And the answer turns out to be no. It just means that the patients going to the doctor are better informed, and so the doctor can't BS them as easily, which I think, in my view, is an improvement. And so that is it. There is also, for instance, there are parts of the service sector that may well be, attacked by robots in a different way. You look at something like e-adjudication, which I actually didn't know anything about until about a year ago, since it's brand new. And so that actually, in some ways, shows how computers can encroach into the legal profession. That said, I would be very surprised if we'd ever see somebody like Antonin Scalia being replaced by a robot. Clarence Thomas may be a different matter, but Antonin's not people of that ilk. In higher education, we have these MOOCs, known ugly word as MOOCs, which are massive online open courses. But in fact, they don't seem, as of yet, to have done anything to make jobs like mine redundant. In fact, if there's anything is the case, it is that parents are more and more keen to send their college-age children to universities like Northwestern or Swarthmore and similar institutions, which have an emphasis on high-quality faculty and individual attention to the students. And I think that will not ever, or at least not foreseeably, be supplied by machines. What I can predict with some certainty is that this destruction will be painful, that jobs will disappear, and it will always be painful. Technological progress is never painless. And that is basically because, labor is not infinitely malleable. We just can't go to, somebody whose job has been made redundant, say, suppose driverless cars become a reality, which I think is something we're all looking at. Well, we're not going to be able to go to these truck drivers and say, well, sorry, your job is gone, but you now have a job as a dental hygienist or something like that. That's not going to happen. People cannot switch jobs that easily, and in that sense, there will be a great deal of pain. And I think that is, we can probably have to think about how to alleviate that pain, but there will be pain no matter what. And it's not for nothing that Schumpeter called technological changes creative destruction. Yes, it is creative, but it destroys. Now, one thing that I'd like to emphasize is that we have long recognized that computers and robots and humans tend to be good at different things. There still is this, I think, $1 million prize that I believe Google has promised to anybody who could build a robot who could enter an apartment the robot has never been in there and make a cup of coffee. And so far, that $1 million, as far as I know, hasn't been claimed. What computers and robots will be good at, and are good at, is performing tasks that are routinized, as David Autor, an MIT economist, called it. Now, routinized jobs basically means boring jobs. And so, my heart doesn't really break if we're leaving these jobs to robots, of course, provided that we can find some arrangement for the people who had them, okay? And so what matters, just if I may for briefly use the lingo of economists, is whether digital technology and human labors are whether they are in some sense substitutes, that's to say they replace each other, or complements, meaning they aid and abet each other. And so what has come out from the data in the last 30 or 40 years is that in some jobs there has been a great deal of machines replacing people, particularly jobs in the middle of the skill distribution. And in others, this has not happened, and it's not unlikely to happen in the foreseeable future. And so my sense overall is that machines and people will, by and large, continue to depend on one another, and that an economy run entirely by, or almost entirely by robots is simply not in the cards. But what robots and machines will do is it will make us more productive, and of course nobody sees anything wrong with that. As Mokyr has said, all production involves some combination of brains and brawn. Okay, the machines can provide the brawn, and they will provide some kind of brain, but not the kind of brains perhaps that people have. It will be hard for a machine to have things like imagination, intuition, and essentially communicate with other machines in a way that we humans do. Also, of course, machines increasingly do communicate with other machines. And what is important to emphasize, and this is something that few people have realized, but Mokyr makes this point very well, is that a lot of knowledge that we have is tacit. The distinction between tacit and codifiable knowledge is due to a philosopher called Michael Polanyi. This is fairly old stuff. And Polanyi basically points out something that once he says it, it's sort of obvious to everybody, which is that lots of things that we do that we don't actually know how we do that, and we can't quite explain how we do that, And so it's not just, sort of obvious things like breaking eggs over a ball, but it's also playing a Mozart sonata or shooting a three-point basket, or engaging in all kinds of tasks that we know how to do. But if somebody would ask you, could you please explain to me how you do this? They could not. I mean, I have many tasks like that. I'm sure everybody in this room as well. And so then the question that you should all ask yourself is, if we don't quite know what we're doing, even if we're doing it well, can we write a program that would have a robot do it for us? And I don't think we could ever ask Stephen Curry to write a program in which he teaches a robot to shoot three-pointers. But even if he did, it wouldn't be very interesting, would it? Okay, so what has happened, as I said, is in the past decades, computers have replaced middle-level occupations. These jobs have been replaced. They have been replaced by relatively routine jobs, and these are jobs but whereas the jobs that require fairly high abstract reasoning or jobs that require some kind of manual dexterity that's hard to codify. Think of your local plumber or your electrician. These jobs are very, very hard to mechanize. It's the jobs in the middle that do this. And so that's what's happening is, and people actually have spoken about the sort of hollowing out of the labor force in the sense that the people who had middle-level skills were being replaced by machinery and computers more than people at the two edges of the distribution. And that, I think, is a finding that is fairly robust. And so the kind of jobs I'm thinking about that's going to be essentially hard to replace are, cleaning and janitorial work, personal health assistance, things like that. And so these jobs may well survive for a very long time. And so, as I said, we're talking about hollowing out or employment polarization, which is a major concern, but it also gives you a bit of an indication of where the jobs may be and where they would go. So here's a graph of the growth of employment. So each of those are essentially percentage growth-wise in different periods between 79, 89, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, and during the Great Recession. And these are sort of ranked essentially on some skilled rank, with the highest ranks right here and the lowest rank personal care and food and cleaning services here. And you can see this hollowing out effect very clearly. The people who were suffering the most are the people here in the middle, whereas the jobs on the extremes of the distribution seem to have grown. Now, of course, they all grew very poorly, in 2007, 2012 because of the recession, but I think that is, again, where much of the pickup is happening. So here's an interesting paradox, which I want to use to illustrate this, and that is the bank teller paradox. So everybody here knows that essentially if you need money from the bank, you don't go into the bank, you go to an ATM machine, which is essentially a robot that dispenses cash. And yet, it turns out that the number of bank tellers in the United States has actually increased between 1980 and 2010, which is a surprising result given the ubiquity of ATM machines, but there you are. And I think the reason why this happened, and people have looked into this carefully, illustrates the complexity of what happens in the labor market. First is that the ATM, because of the ATM machines, there's more demand for tellers, but also because the job of a bank teller has changed. And more of them are engaged in what is known as relationship banking. So what they do is they act as salespersons. They actually get to know the customers, and they introduce them or sell them different services, things like that. So the job of a bank teller has changed. And I must say, I see this from my own experiences because the same has happened with university secretaries. So when I started my career as a young assistant professor, they assigned me a secretary who would type my papers. Well, I haven't had a secretary type my paper in 30 years. I do my own typing, and so does everybody else I know. But we still have secretaries. The secretaries simply do other things. They basically talk to the students and advise them on, which papers to sign, and that course meets in that room, and the prerequisites are this and that. And that's what I used to do, and other secretaries are doing it. And I think that is very much like the bank teller paradox. Yes, machinery makes some people redundant because our secretaries don't type anymore, but we still need them just as much because their jobs have been redefined. So, this is a cartoon of what my life looks like these days, and I would delegate all my responsibilities, so there's nothing left for us to do. All right, so what about the future of work? And so, can more advanced computers equipped with artificial intelligence and quantum computers, who knows what, replace us? And I would say yes. Some people, particularly people in the middle, but more and more moving toward the ends, may well be finding themselves made redundant. And the hollowing out process, therefore, will continue. I must say, ladies and gentlemen, this may sound very heterodox to you and very maybe heretical. I'm actually not so sure that even if the demand for labor were not to keep up with the supply, that would necessarily be the end of the world. So logically, basically, here's what can happen. Okay? Either the number of new jobs will roughly match the ones that vanish, and since population isn't growing very much, that's basically enough. Or else the new number of new jobs will be smaller, and lots of people will be made redundant. And how bad would that be? And I'll come back to that in just a minute. But I want to first talk a little bit about the changing nature of work. And again, that movie, ladies and gentlemen, is one historians have seen. Before 1800 or so, the vast majority of people worked at home for themselves. And basically chose their own hours, they chose their own location, they didn't have to commute. In some ways, it was a very good thing. So people were working as farmers, as artisans, as shopkeepers, teachers, priests, but it all was taking place from their homes. The Industrial Revolution changed all that. It created not just factories, it created the factory system. And the factory system basically means very sharply defined space and time. Okay, you show up at work at this and this place at 7:30 in the morning, and you work until 5, and then you go home, and then you don't work anymore. That's what the factory system is really all about. And so it actually created this concept of a job. I would say before the Industrial Revolution, people worked, but they didn't have jobs. They were, roughly, most of them at least, were self-employed. And a self-employed person doesn't really have a job, but she or he, of course, works. So by 1914 or thereabout, this system was sort of firmly in place in the US and in the industrialized West, and people had jobs. And that is the way our thinking is still going. But in fact, technology is starting to make dents in this system, ladies and gentlemen, and we may be switching back to, in some ways, to a form that's very different from an economy in which people have jobs. Now, we're not going to go back to the medieval artisans working from their cottages, but we do observe more and more, as more and more work is farmed out to these independent contractors who work for themselves. Of course, that would have been impossible for without computers. I came down here by Uber, which is essentially somebody working on a flexible job, but without my smartphone, that wouldn't have worked. Of course, there's also a larger and ever-growing number of people who telecommute. So they still have a job, in some sense. They work for an employer, but they no longer have to show up at work every day at the factory. They work from home. And so I would predict, with some likelihood, that the notion of a job, or of a rigid employment contract that's well-defined, will increasingly become obsolete. And the boundary between work and leisure will become increasingly fuzzy, as it already has been for many people, including, for that matter, college professors. And people will work wherever they want to, and whenever they want to, like my Uber driver. And, this may change the nature of work quite dramatically. It doesn't mean necessarily people will work less hard or more hard. The nature of work will be very different. Now, I hasten to add that greater flexibility is not necessarily an improvement. It is in some ways. If you're a woman and you have small children, and the child is sick, then you want to have the flexibility and not scrambling for somebody to take care of the kid. But of course, flexibility has its disadvantage because it is been a tool for many employers to employ workers whenever they need them and not call them to work when they don't need them. And this is I think, clearly not a very good outcome because it throws all the risk of a volatile demand on the workers and not on the employers. And so we have these sort of temp and contract workers, many of whom I think are not actually enjoying this very much. But as I'm saying, labor will have to adapt to the new economy. But in that sense, there's nothing new, because people had to adapt just as much in the 19th century to the rise of the factory system and work in an employer-defined determined space that was often very unpleasant and very dangerous. And this was realized at the time. So here's a quote from one of my great heroes, Adam Smith. And Adam Smith, who didn't quite actually see factories, but he had some kind of sense of what it would lead to. And he talks about routinized work, and he basically says, look, what these factories did was, that the man who works has no occasion to exert his understanding for removing difficulties that never occurred, and generally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. This is very uncharacteristic sort of hyperbole for this very reserved Scottish philosopher. But this really, and in fact, it's turned out, and that many of the factory jobs turned out to be exactly like that, as you will recall from Charlie Chaplin's famous scene in Modern Times and endless descriptions in, all the way from Marx's Capital to modern economics. And so, I could give you more about it, but I'm starting to run out of time, so and I want to make one or two more points. So what I'm saying here is two things. The transition of the world into sort of more independent, self-employed farmers and artisans to factories was something that, the human race made without, apocalyptic results. Even so, Karl Marx and many other people predicted exactly such an apocalypse. And so, replacing boring and dangerous work in coal mines, in factories, in, shipyards and so on, with robots and machines that do this grueling, arduous, and dull work for us and never get bored, never get burned out, never go on strike, never watch March Madness. I mean, how can that not be an improvement? Just as replacing the sort of hard, back-breaking work in agriculture by tractors and machinery was an improvement. And so here's the sort of $64,000 questions, ladies and gentlemen. If machines do all the work, what will people do? And if they don't work, how will they make a living? That, I think, is the hardest question of all that we have to face. And again, this is not new. And I'm going to quote another very famous economist who had something to say about this. And this is, of course, John Maynard Keynes' famous little essay, which is called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. And basically, what he says, and if you just read the bolded line here, he says, the increase of technical efficiency, or technological change, has been taking place faster than we can deal with the problem of labor absorption. The improvement in the standard of living has been a little bit too quick. That's obviously ironic. No economist would ever think that the improvement in the standard of living has been too quick. I mean, the quicker the better, I would think, because that is what the game is all about. But he does express a concern about what would happen. And what he basically says is that is a really dumb way of thinking about it. Okay, yes, there is pain at the time. He was writing in 1930s, and Britain was in the midst of the Great Depression, and he's worrying about unemployment, and he's worrying about technological unemployment and so on. But basically what he's saying is, listen, he says, this is only a temporary phase of maladjustment. All this means that in the long run, mankind is solving its economic problem. And the economic problem basically is that we're not producing enough, there's scarcity, and therefore we have to allocate. That's what economics is all about. And what he says is, this is the future. So for the first time since his creation, man, this is 1930s, right? It's politically incorrect language, will be faced with his permanent problem. How to use his freedom from pressing economic care, how to occupy his leisure. And then he says, I really like this, he says, this is what's going to happen to the labor 3-hour shifts or a 15-hour week may put off the problem for a great while. Well, I haven't seen the 15-hour week yet, and neither has anybody else, but who knows. But what he says, and this, I really like this statement, for 3 hours a day is quite enough to satisfy the old Adam in us. And of course, what Adam is he talking about? Well, the Adam is the Adam to whom it was said, in the sweat of thy brow, thou shalt eat bread, right? So work, is the only worthwhile thing doing. That's the Calvinist, and I would say also the Jewish ethic, If you're not working, you're not doing anything significant. But the truth is, ladies and gentlemen, that despite the Calvinist or the Jewish ethic, we have been unfaithful to it. We are working less than we used to, a lot less. The world of leisure is upon us. And I think we may well reach a world in which the only people who work will be the people who want to work, who enjoy their work, and they will work as many hours as they want to, and no more. In fact, that is already to some extent what's been happening. This is the number of annual hours worked in a whole bunch of Western economies. So this looks a bit like a spaghetti bowl, I'm sorry, but each of those lines represent an industrialized country. And if you just look at the sort of big picture, so in the late 19th century, the average worker was working, some of them actually more than that, but say 3,000 hours a year. So you can do the math, and that's a lot of work. And where we are now today is essentially many of the European countries in the late 90s were actually hovering around 1,500, which is exactly half. Okay, so here are some numbers of 3 countries that I picked more at random. So you can see by 1870 in the 3 industrialized countries, Germany and Belgium and the US, the average worker works somewhere between 3,300, a little bit more in Belgium, and 3,000 in the United States. And today, in all of those countries, it's fallen significantly. In Europe, a little bit more than in the United States. We work harder than Europeans. If you haven't noticed that, you haven't been in Europe lately. But basically, everybody is working a lot less. In fact, those figures are an understatement, because not only that those people who work fewer hours, but we join the labor force later, because not only everybody goes to 4-year college, but a lot of people go to graduate school, do business school, and blah, blah, blah. So people don't join the labor force until on average, age 23 or 24, whereas in the past we joined at age 16 to 18. And of course, people retire earlier. You know, retirement wasn't even an option in the 19th century for anybody not in the military. Today, you know, average American retires in their early 60s, and so there's still 20 years of good life ahead of them. That's the consumption of leisure as well. So we are actually doing what Keynes said we would do, which is we are working less, even though our income is much higher. Also, the 15-hour work week is still, I think, a long way off. And so, basically, what I would like to submit to you is the decline in working hours isn't so bad. Leisure increases with income. It also increases with physical capability. And, of course, and this is something that very few people have paid attention to unless you think about it, one of the things that technology has done for us, it's made leisure so much more enjoyable. You know, in the late 19th century, even if you had time off, what could you do? Well, you could play cards. If you had money, a lot of money, you could go to the opera or to a theater, and if you didn't have money, you went to some, you know, gaudy play, or the Americans had eye-gouging contests that people came to watch. I'm not sure whether I would enjoy that, but that was actually being done. Now, of course, in the past, there always was a very thin layer of people who did nothing else but enjoy leisure, right? And so, if you read your Jane Austen, you know who they are. This is a fairly small leisure class of noblemen, landowners, and sort of the tip of the middle class. One of the things about these people is they didn't seem to complain about not working. The number of cases in which a nobleman actually went out and picked up a shovel or a scythe and helped the peasants out during harvest is not large. In fact, I have never seen such an example in my entire life. I mean, leisure, even a life of leisure, is something that these people could enjoy very well, and despite this sort of Adamite ideology. Now, to be sure, some of them worked. Some of the most important scientists were actually extremely rich people. If you remember from your physics, Robert Boyle, Boyle as in Boyle's law. So Boyle was a contemporary of Isaac Newton, who was the second richest man in England. So he didn't have to work for a living. He just liked it. He liked doing research and experiments, and so that's what he did. But that's the kind of work I'm thinking of that more and more people will have. And that takes us to the last question. I'll just be very brief about this. So how will people make a living? If people will enjoy that much leisure, how will they make a living? And that, of course, is the question, what can and should policymakers do? And I think this is where Keynes failed. What he didn't understand is that these technological prophecies keep becoming increasingly true, but society faces the issue that the benefits seem to accrue to a relatively small proportion of the population, and that the technological advance that he's talking about is creating an ever-growing wedge between the haves and the have-nots. And aside from the moral implications of that, which I will certainly not go into, but there's, of course, deep political issues here that, in fact, because we are living in a democracy, it is a major concern that the people who feel themselves essentially cut out from the benefits of technological change will not necessarily accept it. And so I want to draw a brief analogy here. We can think of the technological bounties of the next decades as like a windfall. And a windfall, we can look at what happened in other windfalls. So one windfall is that you discover a resource like oil. And then we see something very interesting. Has the discovery of such resources, such windfalls, actually been good or bad for the countries where they discovered them? And the answer is ambiguous, because if you are like Norway or Canada and you discover oil, then in fact it can become sort of what we'd call a progressive welfare state in which much of the population, at least to some extent, shares in the blessings of Russia. Or you become like Russia or like Nigeria, where the fruits of the windfall are basically stashed away in Swiss bank accounts for the benefit of a small, greedy kleptocracy. That's not a function of economics, that's a function of the institutions and the politics of each country. And so I can think of various scenarios in which this would all work. I mean, this guy Pratt, the robotics scientist that I talked about earlier, so he suggests, look at some kind of hypothetical economy in which robots are doing all the work, but everybody owns one robot. And so in that economy, of course, it could proceed without a hitch, and we'd have a lot more leisure time because the robots are doing our work. But if we have a world in which the robot designers and the people who paid for the robots, or probably more of those, will reap all their fruits, then we would need to find some way of designing something which you might call a citizen's wage or some kind of extended social security payment that would allow them to work if they wanted, but allow them also to live a life of leisure if there were no jobs available for them. And of course, that's where the hard politics comes in. And it's not a matter of whether there will be jobs, but whether the distribution will be politically viable or not. Thank you. Is there time for questions, Steve?
We have time. Yeah, we do have time for.
What?
Sorry if someone heard some classical music. It
Okay.
came on right as you were talking about a life of leisure, so I think it seemed
Okay, so
apropos.
I'd
But
like
we
to
do
just-
have time for some questions.
I would love to. If I haven't annoyed anybody, I haven't done my job.
We heard that white middle-aged people who don't have a college education, probably for the first time in history, have their life expectancy shrinking. I thought it would be due to diabetes, due to obesity, things like that. And when I looked deeper, I was wrong. It's suicide, alcohol poisoning, and drugs. Is there a middle ground between that Calvinist ethic that we probably don't have, but living a pure life of leisure supported by the state where, I don't know, maybe people lose the dignity of work, something like that? Is there something in here that may be pointing to why people without a college education who have a declining real income, who are falling behind in society, maybe they're losing a sense of self-worth? Do you think there's any correlation here?
Well, I've seen the same findings that you're talking about. It's only been around for a few days, and I haven't fully digested them. No, I did not expect anything like this. Neither did anybody else. This came as a total surprise that I actually find that life expectancy in certain population groups has actually been declining as a result of things that are largely psychologically induced, as you said, either alcoholism, drugs, suicide, and so on. And I found it as shocking as anybody. I still think the numbers, are not that overwhelming. They're not demographically significant. They're just bad compared to what they ought to have been. But I cannot say I'm really shocked by that, because what you're looking at is exactly the kind of people who are in that hollowed out part of the labor force. And clearly for them, this is a major shock. If you have been in a particular job, in manufacturing, in driving for decades, and all of a sudden, you are being made redundant, or you can't make a living, that is a terribly depressing thing, and I have no real clear-cut solution for that. The only thing I can say to that is that for the next generation, okay, they will be reaping the fruits, and that is in fact one of the lessons of economic history, of economic growth. The price of economic growth is paid for the people who are living through it, who make the investment, whose lives get disrupted, and who are being made redundant. The benefits are reaped by their children, sometimes their grandchildren. And, somebody might well ask, why should we do that? What has posterity ever done for us? It's a hard question, and I don't think I know the answer to that, but that is what history actually shows. It wasn't any different in the time of the Industrial Revolution. I don't think we know how much suicide was committed during the Industrial Revolution. Probably not all that much, but the fact that people went into deep depression and that they drank like fish is beyond any doubt. That's where temperance societies emerged, because of there's so much depression. And that is the cost of technological progress. And I'm very sad to see it, but the alternative isn't any better. The alternative is stagnation, and that has its own prices. But there's no question that change, and this is not news to anybody in this room, change is going to hurt, and people are going to pay a price for it. Now, I actually think that this finding by Nobel Prize winning economist Angus Deaton and his wife is actually good in the sense that now we understand that there is a problem and that there is a certain segment of the population who are particularly vulnerable and sensitive to these economic disruptions, and maybe we should find some way of coping with that. But it is not going to be easy, and it isn't going to be cheap. Well.
Well, I don't know if it was a clear question, but it elicited a brilliant answer.
Can I ask, how does your research allow for a black swan event, like Dirty Bomb or Ted Koppel's new book about the electrical grid being essentially risky?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, so Steve is asking a question, what do I have to say about something like a black swan, which basically means a catastrophic event that was deemed to be extremely unlikely, but then happens anyway, like, a very major cyber attack, a terrorist attack involving, nuclear weapons or anything like that. And in some sense, that too is something on which economic history has something to say, because there is at least one black swan that I always think of, and that is August 1914. That is to say, the civilized world in sort of an insane frenzy, turning on one another for no really good reason, and basically unleashing 30 years of total mess throughout the world, right? Because World War II would have been unimaginable without World War I. And the answer is, this is a major, major concern, because the world didn't cope with it very well. It's not only that the wars themselves turned out to be incredibly destructive, but the period in between was no great shakes either, with the Great Depression, German hyperinflation. I mean, I could go on and on about it. So any kind of major event like that scares the bejesus out of me. And, we're all, I think everybody in this room must remember 9/11. 9/11 wasn't quite the black swan. It could have been, because it turned out later on, we learned this ex post, that it was basically a one-shot event and they couldn't do this before. But let me tell you, the day after 9/11, everybody thought the world had changed dramatically, and I could easily see the decline in international cooperation in finance, in trade, in tourism, in all kinds of things, because travel would have been impossible. That said, I do want to say that I think that as far as scientific and technological progress is concerned, there will be nothing that can stop it. Nothing. Because even the two wars and the Great Depression did not perceptibly slow down the rate of technological and scientific progress in the 20th century. That is, in some ways, something I always keep being amazed at. I don't think actually the wars were any good for technology. It just kept moving the way it would have moved otherwise. Perhaps some things moved a little bit faster. Obviously, aeroplanes developed faster thanks to World War I, and they built, thousands of them, and, antibiotics, a few things. But, on the other hand, the war had an incredible cost. So in terms of daily life, and in terms of the things that we economists care about, it will be costly. It will not stop the rate of scientific and technological progress, because it's too widespread over the entire planet. I mean, the knowledge that is being deployed isn't American knowledge, it isn't German knowledge, it isn't French knowledge, it is everybody's knowledge. And the Western world were to repeat its folly of 1914 and turn on itself again, which I don't think is likely, but who knows, eventually the torch will be picked up by people in Africa, or by people in South America, or people in New Zealand. I don't know where, but the world is, the knowledge is global. That is what the new world really implies. And so nothing and nobody is going to stop it. Not global warming, not war, not any kind of black swan event, short of a major asteroid hurting the planet, in which case we will go the way of the dinosaurs, which some people have been predicting anyway.
Okay, I think we are all set for time. Thank you, Dr. Chris.